Hello and welcome back to Making the Rounds without the really bad text and weird Europe and things on top. Today we're going to talk about day 2 of the group stage, and I feel like nothing really changed. We had different results, but nothing really changed. So to start off with, let's talk about the biggest change in results, which was the fact that UOL went 2-0 instead of 0-2.
And they did so by doing what they did, but harder. They pulled up the Kassadin, and then they had the Vladimir, like the scaling Vlad, which I think are both in the Unicorn's wheelhouse in terms of what they like to do, especially like Kassadin. And then they didn't get rid of the Twitch pick. He was still there. I think one thing that did make a big, not like a big difference, well, I guess it was a pretty large difference, was I think Vizicachi on the Gnar was a good choice, just because I know a lot of people will point out Exiles like flash Hemoplague onto Doublelift and Bjergsen in front of Baron as like the day-defining play, kind of. But I think anytime, and it was followed up by a really good Gnar from Vizicachi, but I think anytime you have a smart top laner like Vizicachi on a champion like Gnar is very like his kit and just the way he looks, like visually, it's really easy to lead a team fight with Gnar if you know how to control the Gnar bar and you have a good understanding of when to TP in. And I think that was shown today with UOL and Vizicachi. So that was the one thing that was a little different for them with me. But in terms of, they still really relied on scaling. And yeah.
I think the thing with UOL that's they just doubled down. They went back to comfort. I think they got really shaken up by yesterday, so when I say they go back to comfort, it makes it sound like they weren't already playing something that they're comfortable with, but they went back to like super core beginning of the year UOL type pickups, which is why like you used to have the Vladimir Syndra matchup, which was super big. I think that they knew that TSM had high Syndra priority. This was something that they could play and have some success with because he's comfortable with the Vlad matchup. And he went even with the old boots, the old start and went boots, you know? First item. It's like we're going back in time and the Ivern comes out, you know?
Yeah.
The Kassadin, also something that they've been playing for a while. And then the Gnar isn't even that. It's Vizicachi plays something that does well in lane.
Yep.
And this is what they do. And it works out. Then they team fight in mid lane. And Daniel Dracos tweets, quick, someone retweet the @Karen Moser thing. And I don't know why. It's like my most successful tweet ever. But
just a circle in mid lane, like avoid here.
Yeah, pretty much. It's a little bit troubling to me because I was excited that unicorns were getting punished for doing unicorns things, and I thought maybe they would have to focus on their problems, which are the jungle mid synergy, which are the fact that their bottom lane doesn't really generate early game pressure, so they will lose dragons. And at least, I think that one thing that Europe used a little bit more to their favor is the fact that they're good with the lane swap still. Like when they went ahead and I think they decided, oh, okay, here's something that we do that North America doesn't do well, and we'll pick a strong top lane matchup and we'll lane swap. And I think this was something that they did deliberately. So it'll be interesting to me if we see North America reacting and predicting these better, because I think we just had instances where they stay bot. The dual lane stays bot, and usually when it happens in Europe, you see a lot of like preempting of swaps because dual lanes will think, oh, they must be swapping because it would make sense for them to swap here. So you get a lot of 2v2 top just automatically in those scenarios. So I think that that's something to look out for, and it's something that UOL used. It's something that Fnatic used today. So I think that that helped them a lot.
Yeah, I think that the North American teams in general, since they do that less, and since even when it does happen, it might, like, a lot of teams when they do it seed pressure elsewhere to the point where a swap isn't necessarily worth it. And so if you're not used to seeing that, I think hopefully North American teams will adjust, because I think that's a good thing to learn in general. Just because it takes advantage of pressure in a way that a lot of other North American teams don't do. So,
and that was kind of the big thing for me. Also, Team SoloMid lost their first game. Do you think that they were, because I was doing interviews during the entire game, so I can't really speak super intelligently about it, but do you feel like they were doing something that, was it consistent with what you were saying TSM problems are, or was it something completely different?
I mean, I think they got, so where the tide really turned, because I think TSM actually had a pretty good handle on this game, and they picked, like, so you go down and you have, like, Bjergsen on the Syndra, Double Lift on Ashe, Biofrost on Tom Kench. So, you know, they were very comfortable with the champions they picked. Hanser kind of, like, tried to get his revenge by killing Vizicachi in the Kled versus Gnar matchup. And then obviously Xerxes, since he was on Ivern, Svenskeren wasn't really, you know, he was allowed to move around how he wanted to. So I mean, it was a very TSM game up until that Baron play. Sure. And I think it's really weird because even though the desk and the casting team seemed to like it a little bit more than I did, I actually thought, so in their first game, Unicorn's Baron was very risky, the 20-minute one, and I thought even though jungler was dead, it could have gone either way. So that was something that made me really nervous, but I thought their Baron fight here...
I remember they didn't even have mid push, so it was super weird.
No, it was... I was not a fan of that. But here, I think they did a really good job of recognizing when they could go in. So Exile, as soon as he realized that Double Lift was available, he immediately flashed Hemoplague. And it was like, even though I pointed out Vizicachi for the Gnar, it was like a really good play from someone who maybe hasn't been having the best tournament, and until a certain point was kind of getting outplayed by Bjergsen on one of his best champions, because Bjergsen has been playing really, really well throughout this entire event, which is also another reason why TSM have looked so good, because Bjergsen does a lot for that team. And the fact that he has kept pretty much constant pressure in mid is, like we touched upon yesterday, it's one of the reasons why Sven has looked a lot better in this at this tournament as well. Especially when you compare to his last international event, the MSI, where people are like, why is he suddenly dying again? And I'm like, he shouldn't have gotten away with this at NA, and I'm glad he's finally getting punished for blind invades that he should not be doing. So with mid pressure from Bjergsen, I think that allows them to do a lot better. So it really came down to that team fighting. And once UOL won that team fight and got the Baron, I think they were just able to snowball that advantage to victory, because from that point they had the tanky Ivern, they had Gnar, they had Vlad, who at that point was, you know, well out of like dangerous territory, even though Bjergsen did have a good Cinder performance. So yeah, and then Zyricon. which everyone should kind of know how strong they are. And Hillsong had some good engages as well. So I think once that happened, UOL were kind of like, okay, we can do what we do best, which is team fight and push and push mid. So I mean, it was, if this makes any sense, it was standard from both teams. I don't think I saw anything new in terms of like TSM problems or new in terms of TSM strengths, and same with Unicorns.
Yeah. I will say that bringing up the point that Exile hasn't had a good tournament and then he makes this play, that probably is a good argument for him going back to Super Comfort, for Unicorns going back to Super Comfort, because if you're putting him in this position where he feels confident suddenly, that's a really big thing. So yeah. I can see why they did it. I just would like Unicorns to be more self-aware of their problems. Let's put it that way. Alright, so sort of covered the Team SoloMid loss. It'll be interesting to see them pull through or to see what they do on the last day of groups. Phoenix?
I think if... Oh no, I was just going to say, I think if Bjergsen continues to play at the level he has, TSM will likely be the North American representative.
I think it'll be a little bit hard for them to not be at this point.
Yeah, like, I don't...
The other two teams are 1-1, right?
Yeah.
And... Or 2-2, excuse me. They went 1-1 on both days. So 3-1 is already an advantage going in. So Phoenix 1, though, is a bit of a surprise. It was kind of interesting because I asked Mike Young if they think that they're the 8th place team, and he didn't want to answer the question. I think if they're actually, because everyone's like, oh, our 8th place team is wrecking your first and second and third place team, but first of all, G2 is in third anyway. But I think it's fair to say that Phoenix 1 aren't really sure where they are right now either. So seeing them show up and do really well, a couple of questions is why might you think that that's the case?
So if anyone heard me talk about Phoenix 1 last split, I talked about how they really made the most from their bot lane pressure. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I haven't seen a lot of people talk about that I'm going to talk about right now is the effect that X Special has had on the bot lane. Because while I don't think that they're going to be like super, pub stomping bot lane, kind of like what we expected from Arrow last split, there's been a very noticeable difference between Arrow and Shady and Arrow and X Special. And I think X Special brings a fairly good engage sense. We even saw that from him on, I believe it's Apex I'm thinking of, where the problem was his communication with his team. Like, he'd get off these really good engages on like Alistar, for example, and then he wouldn't be with the rest of his team. But he still has a really good sense of when to initiate a team fight or when he can get advantage of a good trade in lane, and Arrow is really good at following up on that. So there's obviously two things that have changed, and one is Mike Young, and like I said yesterday, I'm still like unsure as to where I want to put him in terms of how good he is or how good he can be. I'm really looking forward to seeing how he develops. But again, like today, I think we saw Phoenix 1 making sure he was getting on these early game junglers where he can either apply pressure or invade to get vision, stuff like that. He was on the Lise and Lucin. And then we also had Arrow and X Special doing really well. So I think this was I'm not going to say it's necessarily a return to form, but when we looked at Phoenix 1 last split, we saw them doing a ton of 1-3-1s, where Zig would kind of flex between, like, he was one of the few players that played Kled, he'd play Shen, and they try to split with Ryu as well. And I think that today I saw somewhat of a return to that. They still don't have their team fighting worked out, as we saw in the Fnatic game, which was...
I don't even know if that was bad team fighting. Honestly, I don't think it was. I think, like, before you start criticizing their team fight, I think you have to criticize lane assignment, like, why they were in these positions. Like, the bottom... Because you brought up the 1-3-1 stuff, because... The bottom engage, which was the first moment where, like, Fnatic got their foot back in the door, you had Zig out of position without pressure in the other sides of the map, and then they kind of just single file inted in after him. It legit, that's what happened, I feel.
Yeah.
So I think that was more an issue of using the waves and using the map pressure. If you're going to have your top laner extend, you have to have a counter pressure on the other side of the map so that you can trade sides, at least if you don't have the appropriate vision in place. So that was an issue for me. The other aspect that, and then of course the final fight, I think that was just Corki being really fed, and then not
So you're
having,
saying Corki ADC is back, and
them not
Fnatic
having
showed us
enough
all?
MR, or Zig was out of position in that fight as well. Actually, if I recall, he was in a side lane, and they decided to group. So I think that those were, like, the most glaring fights that they messed up. I would say that P1 are surprising a little bit because they're just kind of ripping off the band-aid on invids, and they're doing things that punish poor jungle top synergy and poor jungle mid synergy. In the G2 series, I was really upset because G2 had mid and top pressure the entire early game, but they didn't use it to control river. They didn't use it to get vision in river, to get vision in jungle entrances, so when Mike Young went ahead and invaded, even though it was really bad for him to invade on that side of the map, they couldn't collapse and catch him because they didn't know he was invading, and he invaded on blue buff handoff for G2, so there was no backup from top, and they lost that fight, and it was a big problem for them to get back into the game, and I think that this is fundamentally an issue that you have to talk about when you talk about issues with what's wrong. Why can't we make these early game compositions work in Europe? And the answer is because you're not using the lane pressure well with your jungler. Like, you're fundamentally, it's not using lane pressure that you create and generate with these laning compositions as a team, and this is a bit of a regression back to, like, 2014, 2013, 2012, when...
No.
Europe...
Are you just saying this because we saw Nivea?
It reminded me, it put the pieces in place. It's like, Europe
We're going
knows
back in time.
how to lane. It doesn't know how to transfer its advantages to its jungle. So... doesn't know how to use the momentum or the tempo advantages from its lane in jungle. Like, it understands tempo advantages in the lanes themselves. It understands lane swaps. It understands transferring two lanes, but it doesn't know how to do it with the jungle right now, and I think that that's a little bit troubling. And that's why P1 could just get advantages could just get away with some of these invades, and why, like, maybe Spencer can get away with some of these invades that they would normally want to get punished for in international competition. So I think it's even teaching poor Mike Young bad habits, because he's like, I think we should just be aggressive. Yeah, this isn't what you want to learn at the tender stage of your career. I think it's so for me, this was a big issue for P1, and it's part of why P1 are having so much success right now, is because they are just using better communication between their jungler and their lanes to get away with a lot of this kind of thing.
I think that's another reason why it's so special, and then also another reason why their bot lane is doing so well is because they put Rio on like Corki and LeBlanc, and then you have Mike Young on these early game junglers that can fight and skirmish. And I actually thought this was it was a G2 series. I thought that was a pretty good use of Twitch because they did have the Corki, the Thresh, and the Lee Sin. And even to some extent the Kled, although Expect had Renekton, so he's should technically win that matchup, I believe, early, in terms of like pushing the lane. But I think that where we've seen other teams kind of falter with the Twitch or have to wait for it to scale or something like that, I thought this was actually a really good position for a team to try to pick it. And they did really well with it. In terms of that European lack of mid-jungle synergy, I think Trick is probably still my, like, I'm not going to rant too much about this, but it happened again today, and it was again frustrating to watch where Trick can get early advantages and just, I don't know if he doesn't recognize them. Yeah, I don't know.
Part of it was also just P1 traded the sides a little bit better because Trick put a lot of pressure on the top part, and then they didn't react well bottom when Phoenix went bot in response. Also, I think Trick tried to transfer the pressure from mid, like, so he got the lead in the top side, and then he went bot. And he does this thing when he ganks bot where he just doesn't really pay attention to 2P. And there was the counter gank from P1, and it was just kind of a mess, but yeah. So G2 are definitely troubling, but we already knew that. So
I'm kind of like, I don't want to hope too much about P1, but I really would like to see them maybe not even go back to like a 1-3-1 team necessarily, but just know how to use their pressure better. And I think they're well on that path with X Special and Mike Young on the team. So that makes me happy. Especially like just because P1 were really good last split. I don't think, yeah, it was like their drop off was sudden and awful.
So what do you think, Emily, is wrong with Europe? Why are they losing? First of all, is it something where it's like, oh my gosh, NA is blowing Europe out of the water. Europe are just so screwed. Like, because I feel like that was the response by and large today. In terms
I feel like that shouldn't be the response, because if you watch some of these games, a lot of them were like, so, like, when I look at a team like TSM, for example, who I'm very harsh on because I know that they can be better than they are, and you still have weird things like Sven in random invades and he gets killed, and, like, because everyone has backed and he has no one with him, and so he just dies. And Hanser overextending in lane. Again, like, how many times have you and I either on a video or like just ranting in Skype had talked about how Hanser overextends in lane and he can't get away with it. And somehow he kept getting away with it last split, and now he is not. And I'm not trying to be like, man, TSM sucks. But my point is, TSM is the best performing team at this tournament, right? Like, we can agree on that.
Sure.
And even they have these like very visible weaknesses that you can identify and say, like, they still need to correct this before they would go far at like a larger tournament with teams from China and Korea, where they'd get punished for a lot of these things. So I don't think, and I know you have like something very specific you want to address. So I don't know if I'll be able to like segue into it, but like just watching these games, I don't think the key takeaway is like NA is so much better than Europe or Europe is just bad because I actually think both, I think all
All the
teams at this
regions are
tournament have a
bad.
lot to work on. Maybe that's
Yeah.
just because I'm mean. And I only see weaknesses. Like with my favorite team, all I do is say that they suck and harp on all of their problems. So, but I think if you're watching some of these games, like a lot of them are very close. A lot of them like flip very quickly when teams can't make the most of their advantages and transition them in the mid game. And uh, I think that if you don't see that and your takeaway is that North America is like here and Europe is here, I don't think that that is correct, I guess.
Yeah, I think that that's part of it for sure. Also, I don't know, traditionally, not to use the meme, but Europe does tend to start slower at international tournaments. This is something that they've done consistently for a while. But
Why do you think that is? Because that's not a new thing, right? Like
no,
that's a
it's
thing that's been happening for years.
pretty established thing. I would say the exception would be Origin in 2015. And the reason why at 2015 Worlds is the reason why is because Origin, I felt like from talking to members of that team, they spent more time thinking about the game than playing it. So they had a lot of kind of cute things. I think that Europe as a region likes to have cute things, you know? Like the lane swaps and Fnatic and Unicorns of Love's entire style of play. These are like
Yeah, but the
cute,
Fnatic cannon immediately, and the
cute
just in general
things.
they're drafting all the flexes, all the flex picks,
Yeah,
throw them in there.
it's to me I feel like Europe spend way too much time thinking about how to be surprising. And if you scout them and pay attention, like all of their gimmicks don't work, right? So they have to actually double down and think about more fundamentals and how to play. And I think that that tends to be a big issue with them when they go to international competition. Origin, I think the reason why they were the exception is because they actually figured out the meta itself rather than cute things, if that makes sense. They figured out, they brought the double TP, they did a bunch of those types of trades in side lanes, and they brought the composition, they managed to get like weaker laning comps off the ground. Obviously, we're seeing a trend here. Uh, so I think that that would be like the main exception for me. And then after a while, Origin struggled at 2015 Worlds and started to decline because teams knew what they were going to do. And the thing that they had figured out was no longer going to carry them when they weren't playing as much. I think that tends to be a standard Europe thing as well, where either they bring something that they're really convinced will work, and then other teams either figure it out or and it stops working, or other teams figure it out before they're there, or it's not even good, and they had just kind of deluded themselves for a while. It's Europe is an interesting region. I really like the ULCS because they do have their own way of playing, and I think that that's sometimes frustrating to see, and sometimes it's interesting. So I think that that's a big part of it. The other thing is that Europe also traditionally has been a tournament or a region that's much more focused on worlds. If they have these events like MSI or Rift Rivals, this year's probably the exception where they don't spend as much attention on them. Or maybe that's just a SOAS thing historically. That's always the joke, is that SOAS doesn't really care until the last few weeks of summer.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't know. Yeah, so that's a good question. It's definitely something that's worth unpacking and thinking about more. I would say that for me, though, the thing that people are tunnel visioning on the broadcast, and the people, they're bringing up this engage thing. And I think that actually the region that you look at with the least amount of engage right now in their comps is probably Korea.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
Uh,
They'll still go for like Syra,
they bring
Karma.
engage in their bottom lane a lot. And I think that
Yeah.
that's the thing that's somewhat consistent, is that NA is going for more dueling top lane picks, and then they'll have more engage on their AD carries, which I think that that's a fundamental difference between Europe and NA, because Europe is playing more of like a Jarvan, and the all in top laners and the engaged top laners than are maybe. The example that they brought up was Kled, and I just think Europe doesn't play Kled, right? It's not that Europe plays less engaged, they just don't play Kled. And they play more engage on the top and less engage on their AD carries, because they want to have their AD carries freed up to play hyper carries in team fights. So I think that both regions play this, and you are seeing this in Europe a lot, where you can't even play for side lane picks anymore, because people will just engage on your mid lane in 1-3-1s or 1-4s. So I think that as soon as you show up in a side lane, they disengage mid. And so that to me means that Europe already knew this engage thing was a thing, and this is not the thing that's causing them problems. It's really, really the jungle mid synergy. Like, to me, this is the thing that I'm gonna come home on, and this is the thing that NA is doing better. Which is interesting, because if you look at teams like Cloud9, I would say last split, Cloud9's jungle mid synergy was terrible.
Yeah. In their own words, it was like, I remember talking to Contracts, and he's like, yeah, it was bad. Like, it was really bad. We only started figuring it out. And this isn't like, it's not like they don't get along as people. It's in game, they didn't communicate. So, like, Contracts would go for an invade, and Jensen wouldn't have the wave pushed up, or Jensen wouldn't have warded, or Contracts wouldn't ward for Jensen, and they just were not on the same page. And I think the interesting thing here is that when we talked about MSI, right? Mm-hmm. We're like, every region is bringing their best jungle mid. So, like, Svenskeren and Bjergsen, yes, Sven still does, like, really weird blind invades that he shouldn't. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's on Bjergsen not, like, moving with him. And I think still, like I said today, one of the reasons why Sven has so much leeway sometimes is because Bjergsen does so much for him. But we talked about G2 and how G2's jungle mid was a bit different, because it wasn't reliant on, like, their communication, like you'd say Maple Karsa, for example. Yeah. That'd be, like, I think the gold standard in terms of a jungler, like, and a mid, like, constantly just controlling the game. Mm-hmm. So I think that's interesting that that now extends to the two other European teams that are here. Sure. I think for Broxa and Caps, it's very obvious that, like, because, like, they're an exception to me because they're really young.
Yeah.
And this is their, like, they haven't played together as long. It's not even like a Jensen Contracts thing where one of them is new and the other is experienced. They're both really new, so I don't think it's really fair to be like, well, you guys don't communicate well. It's like, well, they are not experienced players, so I think they're improving. But the Trick and Perks and
Exile Xerxes.
Yeah, I
mean, Xerxes.
Man, Exile Xerxes is the weirdest one.
Because, in Xerxes' own words, sometimes you just lose 2 kills mid and I can't do anything. So, sad times. So I think for me, this is the biggest thing. This should be the takeaway, in my opinion, of what Europe needs to work on. Not, oh my gosh, we're not bringing enough engage. Yes, because we need more team fights. That's clearly what we need. When we have Unicorns of Love that's reliant on team fights mid to win anything, what we need at the top of our region, what we need is more team fights and more engage.
They just need the team fight.
That is going to win
I
us
guarantee
the game.
you. So they go in and they talk about it afterwards, and they're like, guys, we need to team fight mid more.
And
because that's what we're at.
I don't want to call out the analyst desk in particular because I feel like there were still people who were bringing up this jungle mid stuff, and I'm not saying that like the message was completely wrong, completely bad, but I think that if this is what you're taking from this tournament, that is not good. And it's not going to help you get ready for Worlds. It's not going to be like if you think that the engage thing is holding you back, then I don't think that that's a good sign.
You know what it kind of reminds me of, actually, now that you bring it up, and this is going to be kind of a weird, obscure reference, I think, for most people, but do you remember last year at MSI, do you remember RNG's key takeaway?
Oh, God.
That they brought back to China? It was Rift Herald.
Yeah. Rift Herald is the thing that we were messing up, you know?
That was the reason why they lost, is because of Rift Herald. And this is old Rift Herald, by the way, guys.
Yeah.
Not new Rift
Not
Herald.
the new one. I wonder what China's key takeaways are always super fun, but we can talk about this in the other one, because if you want to talk about a region that is not self-aware of what their problems are, good God. Okay. Anyway, this has been Making the Rounds again with Kelsey and Emily, and we will be back tomorrow to talk about the conclusion of Group Stage.